And we just finished a whole section about how action is the key. Action is the core of everything we do in Judaism. We spent 3 chapters exploring the power of a simple physical mitzvah, how it brings God right down to earth and creates a home for God here, even in our soul and in our environment. So beautiful stuff. And please, if you're joining us today for the first time, feel free to review that. This week, and pardon me, I'm going to open up Facebook so I can get comments from anyone joining on Facebook. So let me go to my feed. Here we are. Beautiful. So I see you guys. You can put comments right here. I'm watching to check if there's any questions. Please join our class through Facebook as well. Now we're going to start a new chapter. This is 38, 39, and 40. And here, the Alter Rebbe pivots, our teacher, the Alter Rebbe. And by the way, you may want to know, tonight and tomorrow is a very exalted day in terms of this text and this teacher and this whole system of Kabbalah and Hasidus, in that it is the yahrzeit of our teacher, the Alter Rebbe, Shner Zalman of Liadi. He passed away in 1812. He was actually fleeing from Napoleon as Napoleon was invading Russia. For various reasons, he believed the Jews were better under the Tsarist regime than under Napoleon, because he believed that would keep our faith stronger and keep us connected to Judaism. So he was fleeing Napoleon's armies because he had in fact been helping the Tsars with spies and with information and in all kinds of ways. And he didn't want to be under the rule of Napoleon either spiritually, even for 1 minute. So it was the dead of winter he was fleeing, and he became ill because of the terrible conditions. It was very, very cold. And after Havdalah, it was that year was Shabbat, right? I don't know the whole story. Sorry, that's not clear on. But I think after Havdalah, he passed away. So this is actually marked by anyone who learned Tanya, this text. It is marked as an important day. And we also believe that, as we said before, the souls of everyone, and certainly the souls of great tzaddikim, are in a constant journey, ebbing upwards and going towards the divine light, so to speak. But there's also an ebb where they come closest to our physical realm, and their yahrzeit, the date on which they died, is considered the time when that soul is the closest to us as we are here in the physical world. So not only can we connect with them in the deepest way, but they also have a great degree of influence in terms of requesting blessings, whatever it might be. So a beautiful day for us here to be learning the Tanya. And by the way, I've got a picture. Maybe I'll pull up our Tanyas that we're printing are now in New York being bound. There's 4 massive boxes of photocopies. It took us 3 days, but we've got all of our printed Tanyas that we printed here at Temple in New York being bound. So I'll let you know as that moves along. So to start chapter 38, the Alter Rebbe just spent 3 chapters telling us, I know love and awe, this is what we're working on. We want to connect, they're important, but you should know really the whole main thing. Thanks, Doron. Good to know you're here. How you doing? On Facebook. The whole essence of everything is the action. When you do an action mitzvah, that creates a home for God, and you can't compare anything else. And even a tzaddik with great love and fear of God came down here just to do a physical mitzvah like you, because that makes a home for God. And that brings the culmination of history in terms of, as we say in Reform Judaism, the Messianic era. The whole world is now spiritual and peaceful. God willing, it should happen this afternoon, right? With everyone in harmony and together, as they should be. So now, what's the problem? I'm maybe going to go home and I'm going to say, okay, action mitzvahs, that's all that matters. My love and awe, that's not what I came here for. I'm just going to go ahead and do a mitzvah, do another, and that's all that matters. And it could become mechanical and dry, which is not at all what Judaism is supposed to be. We're supposed to be full of love and full of intention. So now, in case we got the wrong idea, the Alter Rebbe, so to speak, pivots, and we'll spend the next 3 chapters talking about how important, how essential Kavanah is. And for anyone who may not know the term Kavanah, that means everything from my focus when I'm doing a mitzvah, to the sense of emotional excitement that I have when I'm doing a mitzvah, to even higher, more profound kabbalistic intentions that I might have when I'm doing a mitzvah. There's a whole world. And let's distinguish when we start between the very basic meaning of kavanah, meaning, is that what I had in mind, right? Because it's one thing to say, I did something just on automatic. I didn't notice I was doing it and my mind was elsewhere. And, you might be driving somewhere and you started thinking about a project or a scenario and suddenly, you're in the zone and you're gone and you arrive at your destination. You're like, I wasn't even intending to drive somehow. I don't know. And maybe that's a bad example, but if I do a mitzvah, I don't know what it'd be. Say I happen to, for some reason, build a booth in my backyard on Sukkot, or no, say Pesach is coming up, right? Not coming up, but soon. Say I happen to have a matzah sandwich, on the first night of Pesach, but I was just snacking. I was just hungry. No intention to eat it for Passover. Now I've done it, and I've done the physical mitzvah, but I didn't have an intention to do a mitzvah. Whereas if I'm at a Seder and I'm distracted and I'm not really into it or for whatever reason, but I'm having matzah because you're supposed to have matzah, now I had the basic intention to do a mitzvah. So kavanah can mean that's just what you meant to do. That was what you had in mind. So a mitzvah does need that basic level of kavanah to be considered a mitzvah, that I intended to do it. But here we're talking about beyond that. We're talking about if I buy flowers for my wife and I just leave them on the ground on the front door at the house without wrapping them, without a card or anything, she'll find them. She got flowers, right? It's done, right? Okay, I gave my wife flowers, but she's not going to be so happy. When you give someone flowers, what matters is the thought. You have to smile. You have to put a beautiful card with a message. You have to let them know with your eyes what this represents. And really, in many ways, in human interactions, it's the thought that counts. It's the thought that counts. And we see it by the opposite. If I were to approach a stranger on the street and give them a bouquet of a dozen roses, they'd think it was very strange, right? Because they don't want to receive flowers from me because it's the thought that counts. I'm not supposed to be having those thoughts about a stranger. With my wife, now I might, maybe the flowers got damaged in transportation but if she gets that I have a beautiful message and that I mean that I love her, now she's going to love these flowers. So that's the kind of kavanah we're talking about when it comes to a mitzvah. Not just that I had in mind, but the amount of emotion I put into it, the amount of connection that's there, and the amount of deep feeling that I put into it. And we're going to learn in this chapter, how that adds a soul to the body of the mitzvah, because the first metaphor we're going to use is the mitzvah of a soul and a body. The metaphor of a soul and a body, and that a mitzvah is like a body, but it needs my kavanah to be its soul. And then we're going to go on and learn about how kavanah, there's 4 levels of kavanah. We'll get to that later. And finally, also learn about how we can kabbalistically use our intention to elevate any mitzvah we do to higher and higher spiritual worlds. And there's a technique involved that we'll learn. So there's a whole journey of how important kavanah is after you've done the mitzvah. But before we get to that, the Alter Rebbe is going to reinforce, by the way, when I'm about to say this, remember, the mitzvah is still the main thing. So he starts by reinforcing the last 3 chapters and saying, true that a mitzvah is the main thing. So here's perhaps a mashal, a metaphor that kind of explains the relationship we're about to see between the physical act of a mitzvah and then the kavanah that's going to elevate it. It's like a 1 and a 0. So the mitzvah is the 1 and the kavanah is the 0. So to start the whole thing, I need a mitzvah to create any value, right? Zeros on their own, you can add as many zeros as you want and draw them as big as you want, it's still 0, there's still nothing there. But if I add a simple 1 first, I put a 1 on my page, now when I add that 0, what happens to that 1? It multiplies by 10. Put another 0, now it's times 100. Another 0, and off you go. So the mitzvah is that first 1 on the page, and that starts everything. And without it, there's no value. But then, of course, without the zeros, you just have a 1. You're not amplifying and amplifying. So the mitzvah is the ikar, it's the core, it's the beginning of everything, but the kavanah is also crucial, as we'll learn. So any questions about that either here or online before we dive inside? Anybody, any thoughts? Jokes? Any anecdotes? Okay, let's go. So Cindy, we'll start with you. We're on chapter 38. That's page 528 in the Tanya. And let's dedicate our learning to the soul of Shner Zalman of Liadi. You should have an elevation that the Tanya is being learned here at Temple Israel. V'hinei im kol hanichtav le'el yuvan hetev pesak halacha arucha batalmud poskim dehirhur lav kidibur dameh.
In light of all that has been said above concerning the particular virtue of mitzvot performed in action and speech in their elevation of the vital soul to holiness, one will clearly understand the halachic decision expressly stated in the Talmud and the codes that meditation is not valid in lieu of verbal articulation.
Right. And so he's saying, remember what we said, when you're saying the Shema, if you don't actually pronounce the words, you haven't halachically said it, has no value. So you have to actually say the words of the Shema. But other than the very first line, the Shema Yisrael line, if you just go through them quickly in a rush and get them out, even if you have only the basic intention that you're saying the Shema, but there's no feeling, you don't stop, you don't meditate as we learned, zero of that, you still halachically said the Shema. That's the one, right? You've now started things. Should you add zeros? Absolutely. But without actually saying it, now you just have zeros. And if I sit and I ponder on the Shema and I go deep into that meaning and have a very spiritual, moving experience, that's just all zeros on the page in terms of the prayer. I haven't gotten that one. I haven't said it. And by the way, he uses a particular word. He uses hirhur, which is translated as meditation, but it's more specific than that, as often is the case in Hebrew. Hirhur, so machashava means general thought, the whole thought process, machshava. Hirhur actually means when you talk in your mind. So, when you're reciting a conversation perhaps in your mind, or when you're memorizing something and going through it in your mind, you're actually saying words of thought in your mind. That is the Hebrew word hirhur. So he's being very specific. Even if I say the Shema, the text of the Shema in my mind, and focus on it, and I've heard those words, it does not count as halacha. And it's very interesting because in the human experience, as we've said, it is the thought that counts, right? If I think I love you, I love you, I love you to my wife, she doesn't know what I'm thinking necessarily, and it doesn't reach her. But with God, who knows our thoughts, it seems like why wouldn't we be able to just think prayers? Right? God's not like another person that can't read my mind. God's very aware. So why is it that you're not halakhically allowed to just recite a prayer in your mind? You have to say it. And of course, the answer is we want to actually change the physical world and elevate the physical, the animal soul that has to drive the mouth. That is what we said in the last 3 chapters. That's why. But without that, you'd think it'd be fine to just meditate on a prayer. In fact, not. We have to bring it down to the physical and create that one. Thus, v'im kara kriyat shema b'machashavato, uv'libo levad b'chol koach kavanato, lo yatsa yedei chovato v'tzarich lachazor v'likrot.
Thus, if one recited the Shema in his thought and heart alone, even if he did so with the full power of his concentration, he has not fulfilled his obligation of reciting the Shema by merely meditating on the words that comprise it. He must repeat it verbally.
Right, so no matter how profoundly I've meditated on the Shema in my mind, if I didn't say it out loud, now I have to repeat it. Right? It doesn't count. You didn't create that beginning. You didn't plug it in to get things going unless you said it. Action is the key. Same is true. We're at Doreen. Why don't you go next? And we'll be Doreen next, then Sue Ellen, then Eleanor. Oh yeah, we're skipping. Sorry, Doreen, then Sue Ellen, then Rick, then Paula, then Joyce, then Noreen. So Doreen, if you unmute, And we're very good. Doreen's background is sending me into the cosmos.
Okay,
It's beautiful.
I got
Good.
it. The same is true of the blessing after meals ordained by the Torah.
Right, so also, Birkat Hamazon that we sing at Camp George and bang on the tables and jump around. It's amazing. The kids actually have to be singing it, and beautiful how they sing it there with so much energy, because the more energy we put in, the more of my animal soul I elevate, as we learned. And similarly, uvishar brachot Rabbanan uvi tefillah. Sue Ellen? Oh, you're still muted, Sue Ellen.
There we go. And similarly with other blessings, although they are merely rabbinic in origin, and so too with prayer. Although prayer is the service of the heart, it cannot be confined to the heart, but must be articulated orally.
And it's a beautiful example, because what is prayer? Avodat halev, service of the heart. Prayer is all about inspiring myself to care about God, to connect to God, to elevate myself. And yet, even with prayer, which is service of the heart, and it's about feeling, if I've just meditated and recited the words with hirhur, now it hasn't started. I haven't begun to pray. I have to actually articulate the words. V'im hotzi b'sfatav v'lo kiven libo yatsa yedei chovato b'di'avad v'ein tzarich lachazor.
If, on the other hand, one spoke the words of Shema prayer, etc., but did not concentrate his thought, he has, post facto, fulfilled his obligation, although he was initially required to concentrate and need not repeat them with concentration.
And so even if I said the Shema, as I said, and I got distracted and I just rattled it off without really meaning it, as long as I had some intention for the first line, I don't have to repeat it. I've halakhically said it. Levad mi pasuk rishon shel kriyat Shema uvracha rishona shel tfilat Shmona Esrei. Except I think Paula, would you like to unmute and read? Top of 530.
Okay. Except for the first verse of Shema and the first blessing in Shemona Esrei, where the law requires one to repeat them if he did not concentrate on their meaning while reciting them.
And so just as an aside, if you're saying the Amidah and you get through the whole first paragraph and then you wake up and you realize you hadn't focused on them at all, the law technically is you're supposed to repeat them. I believe it's shifted though, and we've been told you shouldn't repeat it a second time because probably you won't focus as much the second time. So I'll leave it up to you how you want to handle that. But the overriding point is the mitzvah of prayer is verbal articulation, even though it is service to the heart. And then you want to have kavanah, as we'll learn. But if you haven't actually spoken it, you haven't plugged into the system. We're not creating value in the way we're talking about here, where we're elevating the world and unifying it with the Ein Sof. Uchidita b'reish perek b'divrachot ad kan mitzvat kavanah mikan ve'elach mitzvat kriya v'chulu.
It is thus written, tractate Berachot, beginning of chapter 2, until the end of the first verse of Shema, the mitzvah is concentration. From here on, the mitzvah consists of recitation, and one has fulfilled his obligation, even if he did not concentrate.
So I think we've clarified the point, which is we're going to learn about kavanah, about intention, but keep in mind through this whole thing, the intention, the kavanah, only has value once there's a mitzvah for it to attach itself to. And then it has tremendous value and it's essential. Any thoughts about that? That can be a little challenging in our community because we really, naturally we value my experience. We want services and we work very hard for services at Temple to be moving. And when we learn, we want to have a profound experience. We want to feel connected. And as seekers, I think all of us really, we place tremendous value on the level of Kavanah that we're experiencing. So how does that land on you to hear the Alter Rebbe say so concretely, unless you've got verbally articulated prayer or a physical mitzvah, the Kavanah it's just a bunch of zeros and it's not elevating anything. Does that make you kind of push back, or I'm curious what you think?
Does that mean that intentions that are not fulfilled via saying the prayer are, what happens to those intentions? What becomes of them?
Okay, so I think you might be referring to a different phenomenon where I intend to say something, but I don't get to it. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's another law, which is if you intend to do a mitzvah, it's like you've done the mitzvah and you get the reward for the mitzvah. So that's not the kind of intention we're talking about. If someone is about to pray and they need a siddur, and I run and I get a siddur from my office and I bring it to them, but somebody else got there first. Okay, I because I intended to do it, even though it wasn't needed when I got there, it's as if I'd done the mitzvah. It counts and it elevates. But here we're not talking about future intention. We're talking about intention in terms of the focus, the feeling, the sense of personal connection that I have while I'm doing it. So really the statement the Alter Rebbe is making is, until you've spoken a prayer or done a physical mitzvah, that intention has no vehicle to elevate anything. Yeah, so not a future intention, but a current intention. Does that make sense?
Very much, thank you.
Yeah.
Cantor, I know personally, I always have a hard time concentrating on the prayers. On a personal note, since you do it so often and through temple, you may do it 3 or 4 times over the high holidays. How do you personally handle this concentration issue throughout your prayers?
It's a good question. So if for whatever reason I'm finding it's hard to concentrate on prayers, what are the approaches for deepening my focus? I think the next 3 chapters will give us some tools to do that, because for 2 reasons. One is the more you practice something, the stronger you get at it. We know the brain has plasticity, and every time
the more you get at it, but it also becomes more rote that way. Correct?
It can, yeah. So that's a danger, is that it just goes on automatic. So you're right. I don't mean the more times I say the prayer, the more effective is my focus. I mean, the more times I push myself to focus deeply, the more I become wired to do that. So we've learned about the capacity for focus, which is called da'at in Kabbalah, da'at, right? The three sfirot that Chabad is named after, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, are the 3 aspects of intellect. Da'at is the capacity to focus deeply so that I feel something. So not the more times I say a prayer, but the more times I push myself to focus deeply for a lengthy amount of time, I increase my personal capacity for focus and da'at, and I increase my ability to generate feelings, as we learned. And of course, the long short path, the meditation that we've been practicing, is key to that as well, because as I focus my mind on a godly concept with profound da'at, now I generate intellectually created feelings that I have access to at any time. So now I'm excited to pray because I'm gonna have love and awe, and I like that feeling. So even my animal soul is interested in sitting and praying and gets into the game. So one of the tools is training and repetition, and getting ourselves to be masters of our own focus. But the second really is reframing, because I may think, well, I'm just a temple saying prayers, and I hope people like the sound of my voice, and I've done my job in Shabbat, and leave it at that. And maybe at that point, after the 1000th service, I'll get a little bored. It'll be hard to have my head in the game. That might be true. But what if I'm doing something that is bringing down godly light? I'm representing everyone in the room, and in some way, everyone at temple, so thousands and thousands of Jews. And this light I only have access to right now, because when today passes, now there's a new packet of divine light that's available. And that light can really change people's lives in terms of whether they're ill, it might bring blessing for healing, whether they have income that they need and they're desperate for income, and this will unlock the blessing for that income. whether it changes and elevates the world because we've given tremendous amounts of tzedakah and that needs to be harnessed and elevated. Now suddenly, I'm in a very, very important situation and I'm naturally at my best because it's not only important, but it's urgent. It's not only important, but it was urgent. And like any important and urgent scenario, I'm going to be at my best. I'm going to be engaged. So I think it's a great question. How do we keep ourselves focused and with Kavanah? And these 3 chapters give us both techniques to practice so I become masterful at focus, at dot, and B, a powerful way to reframe prayer or any mitzvah so that I will naturally have emotions, just like when there's any other important and urgent matter. That's my kind of answer. I mean, maybe other people have other answers. There's other people here who have meditation and prayer practices. How do you guys deal with that question?
I have a hard time dealing with it personally, but that's why I'm asking you for your advice. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
when I go to temple on Friday nights, I mean, it's wonderful, but I find myself listening to prayers and I'm seeing this person over there and seeing that person over there, and it's a schmooze, and I lose my focus. So that's why I'm asking for your help.
Got it. Yeah, I think these chapters will be very beautiful for that goal of yours. Sue Ellen, did you want to add something?
I think that we have to cut some slack for ourselves in that every day is different. And whether it's prayer or meditation, sometimes we succeed to our own expectations and sometimes our mind wanders. And I think if you don't beat yourself up over it so much, but accept it and just try and focus the next time a little deeper, that's what helps me.
Yes, and there's many modes for prayer. So let me follow up on what you're saying, Sue Ellen, because on one hand, on Shabbat, when we're at temple and we have time there, we really want our focus to be at its best, our kavanah to be elevated. But if you look at how prayer happens in its full expanded practice in the traditional community, where you're praying 3 times a day, there's many modes that prayer goes through, and they all have value, and you can compare it to many things. So, when you're here on Friday, you might compare prayer to, sitting at the opera, and you want to have a moving experience. Everything should be beautiful. You should understand every word. That's the ultimate. But sometimes it might be, you landed your plane, you just want to check the engine and all the safety points and get it up in the air as quickly as you can again. Or it's the morning and you got to make lunch for 3 kids and also get to work. And is anyone going to complain if you're not, if you were on the plane, if you're in the runway waiting for the plane to take off and you saw a mechanic slowly and with joy going through every point and, checking the engine and meditating on the bolts and then going through, you'd say, wow, it's amazing. My airplane mechanic has such beautiful intention. Look at all the meaning he's putting in. No, right? We want to get in the air, like do a good job, make sure we're safe, but do it quickly, right? Make sure you're trained to do it quickly. And that's the value in that moment. Sometimes prayer actually is like that, right? I mean, you want the basic kavanah to be there and you want as much as you can fit in. But sometimes in the middle of the day, especially the mincha prayer for anyone who does that, really the biggest kavanah is just stopping some very important project you might be in to say mincha and get it done as quickly as you can, and then get back to some project you're working on. And the value is that you stopped your day to recognize, not that you had a 30-minute deep experience. And then later, there's a way to take that prayer and elevate it with additional kavanah. That's part of the techniques we'll learn. So you're right, Sue Ellen. Not every time that I pray do I need to have this luminescent experience. Sometimes I'm a little distracted or I'm in a rush, and it all has value. We shouldn't think if on occasion I get distracted that means it wasn't of tremendous worth. But this is it's something we want to touch on, because I think especially in the Reform movement and perhaps the Renewal movement, we elevate kavanah to a level where it's I said we may lose track of whether or not it was attached to a physical mitzvah, and that now our kavanah is elevating the world, whereas sometimes it becomes just a feel-good, wonderful experience for me that may change my outlook, but maybe it's missing that one that we talked about. Good. Let's go on. Any thoughts from our Facebook folks? All right, let's go on. והיינו משום שהנשמה אינה צריכה תיקון לעצמה במצוות. I think we're at Noreen. So this is middle of
This is because the divine soul does not need to perfect itself through mitzvot.
And so this is the last three chapters. The divine soul does not need fixing. It does not need repair. It didn't come down here to fix itself. And if it was all about the divine soul, it'd be still up in heaven, experiencing tremendous love and awe of God and seeing the divine light. It didn't need to come here. It came here to elevate the lowest realm, make a home for God, and elevate the animal soul. רק להמשיך אור לתקן נפש החיונית והגוף. And Susan, do you want to read for us?
Unfortunately, I don't have the correct chapter. I have to
Okay,
pass.
yeah, if you email Maya at temple-israel.org, she can send it to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Cindy, let's go with you. This is accomplished.
No, rather, the goal of mitzvot is to draw down godly light to perfect the vital soul and the body.
Thanks. So that's the last three chapters. We're drawing down light for the sake of elevating the physical objects of my mitzvah, my animal soul, and as well, all the physical surrounding environment that's associated with it to perfect my share of the world and elevate it. על ידי אותיות הדיבור שהנפש מדברת בשם, בה"א מוצאות הפה, וכן במצוות מעשיות שהנפש עושה בשאר איברי הגוף.
This is accomplished by means of the letters of speech, which the soul utters by means of the 5 organs of verbal articulation and through the mitzvot of action, which the soul performs by means of the body's other organs.
Right, and in case you thought this was just a mechanical plug, remember we're using our 5 organs of articulation to bring down the power of each of the Hebrew letters contained in the Hebrew words we're saying when we're praying. And there's a whole kabbalistic system which we learn we actually learned here in Shar Yichud of the Alter Rebbe, of how each of these letters pulls down one of the divine forces. So there's a whole world of a whole system that is elevating the world as we're praying. It's amazing. But that's all a preamble to get into now the message of the next 3 chapters. So here we go. And we begin with, as I said, the metaphor of a body and a soul, where if you need a metaphor to, Rick, as you said, inspire you when you're praying, or make sure that you're really digging deep when you're doing a physical mitzvah, think of your mitzvah as a body, a beautiful body, an amazing, maybe beautifully crafted, but a body has not much point if there's not a soul enlivening it. You need to have a soul enlivening it. So once I've done a mitzvah with the basic, I'm doing a mitzvah in my mind, now I've got a vessel, I've got a body, but do I want that body to be slack and not animated, or do I want it to be alive and able to warm up the world and make change? Of course, we want to give that body a soul, and that body has no soul without my kavanah that I'm adding. So the Alter Rebbe is not saying that kavanah needs to be attached to a mitzvah to say that kavanah has little value. It's just the opposite. Just the same way my soul, just the same way my body, it really cannot accomplish anything without my soul enlivening it. So this mitzvah is waiting for my kavanah to elevate it. And in fact, that will allow it to elevate the world that I'm repairing much, much more powerfully, as we will learn. Af al pi chen amru tefillah or shar bracha belo kavanah hen keguf belo neshama. Doreen, I think it's up to you, yet nevertheless.
Yet nevertheless, it has been said that prayer or any other blessing said without kavanah is like a body without a soul.
So the Alter Rebbe brings down a saying of the sages that if you say a prayer or a blessing without any deeper intention, now you've got a body that is yet to receive its soul. A body that's yet to receive its soul. It's powerful. And there's nothing that body can accomplish. It's there, it's physical, it's in the world, but it has yet to spring up and move around and create change in the world. Perush ki kmo shekol habrim sheba'olam hazeh sheyesh lahem guf neshama. Sue Ellen, you can do the next.
This comparison of the words of prayer to the body and of Kavanah to the soul means just as all the creatures of the world possessing a body and a soul.
Shehem nefesh kol chai v'ruach kol basar ish v'nishmat kol asher ruach chaim be'apav mikol ba'alei chaim.
Meaning the nefesh of every living being, the ruach of all flesh, and the neshama of all that has the breath of life in its nostrils among all living creatures.
All right, so we're very familiar with this, right? Everything in the world, of course, and we'll get into this later, of course, human beings, which we call medaber, speakers, animals, which we call chaya. It's quite evident that they have a body and a soul that animates them. Also, plants, the third category, tzomeach. You can see that a plant has a body and then a soul that's enlivening it. The buds will open and close. It will grow. It's slower, right? A child might look at a plant and not be sure that it's alive at first, but we know. But even domim, even the inanimate world also has a body and a soul that gives it a certain degree of divine light that we're going to call life source, even though it's so contracted that it can't even grow. It certainly can't move around, and it doesn't have intellect and will, etc. But it does have a soul. So everything has breath. Well, you know, here he's really talking about living things that have breath. So we'll leave plants and certainly inanimate out of it, but they'll come in later. והשם מחיה את כולם ומהווה אותם מאין ליש תמיד באור וחיות שמשפיע בהם. We're at Paula, are we at you now? There you go.
Okay. Starting with, meaning the nefesh of every living being, the ruach of all flesh, and the neshama of all that has the breath of life in its nostrils among all living creatures.
And one more, God animates them all.
Okay. God animates them all and creates them constantly out of nothingness by the light and vitality which he bestows upon them, upon both the soul and the body, and in support of his contention that the body too has a godly life force aside from the soul, the Alter Rebbe adds parenthetically.
Very good. So every living thing certainly has a body and a soul. And now we'll get to, as I mentioned, even inanimate materials, stones, mountains, ice cubes, whatever you have it, icebergs. All these also have something like a soul. Everything that exists has a soul. And that soul is in the form of light and vitality from God so that it exists. And some things only have enough contracted vitality such that they exist and they're not nothing. שגם הגוף החומרי ואפילו אבנים ועפר הדומם ממש, יש בו אור וחיות ממנו, יפרח שלא יחזור להיות עין ואפס כשהיה. Or even? Yeah, Joyce, why don't you go ahead and unmute? Thanks, Joyce. Oh, you're still muted. You're still muted. There you go.
For even the material body, and furthermore, even the very stones and earth, which are absolutely inanimate, lacking even that sign of found in plant life, i.e. growth, even the totally inanimate being has within it light and vitality from God, so that it should know, maybe not, that
Not,
missing,
not.
I don't have that,
Yeah, not revert.
not revert to naught and nothingness as it was before it was created. Now, is it just things made by nature and God and not made by people, except like art would have a soul?
No, interesting point. Yeah. So if we're talking about from the point of view of enjoying art, I could say any creative idea certainly you could say has a soul. It has vitality, and so you see a Shakespeare play, you see a great work of art by Picasso, and you could say, yeah, that piece of art has a soul, and we have a relationship with it. Who hasn't seen a great work of art and sense they're connecting to something? But here we're talking about the actual physical objects themselves. So whether you have a great statue carved out of marble, and you could say, yeah, that work of art has a soul, okay. But here we're just talking about the actual marble itself. So whether that marble was, a block of marble hidden in a mountain somewhere that just had physical reality, or whether it's the actual marble in a beautiful carving, the physical marble, which is inanimate, that itself has a soul beyond what you say might be the soul of that work of art. So here it's much simpler. We're saying any physical object, whether it's so-called, in nature and created by nature, whether I've taken it out of nature and I've turned it into something, it still has a soul that is making it a physical object, right? My mask that I'm wearing, right, whether it came from cotton or whatever, now we've made something of it, but that physical material has a soul, which is what's keeping it in existence. So it's not now out of existence and back to nothingness. And that's the soul we're talking about.
I have to go. I'm sorry.
No worries. No worries. Does that answer? Thanks, Noreen. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it's the raw material.
Yeah, the raw materials, whether we've fashioned them to something or not, anything physical has a soul. It's like quantum science has also touched on that. Everything physical really is just energy, somehow warping or shaping itself into something that feels like it's physical. But you go deep enough, and it's just energy. There's no physical anything in there, right? So that is science having a look at the divine light and energy that is feeding every physical thing. It looks like it's physical, but really it's empty space with just energy there. So science and Kabbalah actually see eye to eye these days. ואף על פי כן אין ערך ודמיון כלל בין בחינת אור וחיות המאיר בגוף לגבי בחינת אור וחיות המאיר בנשמה שהיא נפש כל חי. I think back to Cindy.
The Alter Rebbe now concludes the sentence begun earlier. Just as in all the creatures of this world possessing a body and a soul, there is nevertheless, despite the fact that body and soul are alike in that they both contain a divine life force, there is nevertheless no comparison or similarity between the quality of the light and life force radiating in the body and the light and life force radiating in the neshama, which is the soul of every living thing.
All right, so now here, I want to try and say this next section, these two chapters, I watch a lot of people that teach Tanya. I learn Tanya with people to make sure I'm on track and I have the right ideas organized. I have to say, great teachers, it's very hard to make this section of the Tanya clear because there's so many parts moving around in this next explanation. So I'm hoping I do a good job, but we'll try and keep it as simple as possible because there's a lot of ways of looking at it. There's a lot of ways of trying to teach it, and it can get very, very abstract and complex. So for anyone that's learned Tanya before, we're going to try and go for pretty cut and dry and simple here. But the quality that the Alter Rebbe is going to teach us about now in Kavanah that is superior to the quality of a mitzvah, which is the ikar, which is the essence, the core, rather. The quality of the advantage of Kavanah is the same as the quality in terms of, what did he describe? light and life force that is in my soul versus the quality of a light and life force that is in my physical body. My physical body comes from the physical world. It's calcium and carbon and oxygen. It's all come together, and it does, that physical stuff does have a light and a life force, but that light and life force is extremely contracted. It's not, let's call it apparent. It's not radiating. Whereas in my soul, that light and life force, it's shining. You know, you meet someone, you try and look into their soul, and you see, this is a someone that radiated down from, it's a spark of God, and look at their creativity, their emotions, the sense of beauty, their caring. When you look at someone's soul, you get lots of light that is expanded, that is bright, that is manifest, that if you just looked at someone's physical body, you don't see. There it's contracted. So the advantage of Kavanah to the mitzvah is just like that. Yeah, Purim's coming up, and so I bring shalach manos to someone. I bring a gift to someone's house. It's a mitzvah, but in those homitashin, or in those dates or whatever I bring, it's just physical stuff. You look at it, and is it really any different than the physical stuff that is sitting in a bakery? Some croissants that are in Paris. The physicality of it is all the same. You look at it, and it's all contracted light. It's not manifest light. But if I give it with deep intention that this is Purim, and I want to create joy, and I want to create a connection between us, and I'm connecting to the story of thousands of years ago, and I bring it with a nice song and a smile, now when I add that kavanah, there now you can see the light, right? There now you can see, there's something that's coming from outside, that's coming from above, that is apparent, that is radiant, that is shining. It's not contracted, it's expanded. So to put it very simply, the difference between the mitzvah, the physical mitzvah, and the kavanah is like the difference between my physical body with its contracted light, which is almost, hard to see anything there, versus my soul with its intellect, its emotions, its sense of animation, its caring, its connection, where there, of course, you see the light. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. I promise to keep it simple, but just one caveat, and that is what makes it complicated. If you've learned Tanya elsewhere, what makes it complicated is that along with the sense of contraction and expansion of light, there's another phenomenon we learned about, and that is hester panim, concealment of the countenance. So here, when we're talking about God's essence, not God's light, but God's essence, which comes through in every mitzvah, now God's essence is hidden not only in the physical aspect of the world, but also in the spiritual aspects of the world. God's countenance is hidden everywhere. If you traveled up to even Atzilus, the highest spiritual world, and you could do what souls in Atzilus do, I don't know myself, and you said, where's God's countenance? It's just as concealed there. You're no closer to God's essence in Atzilus than you are down here in the physical world. That's concealed everywhere. But in terms of hester panim, God's essence, every physical mitzvah is completely transparent to God's essence, as we just learned. So in terms of this hester panim, every spiritual world has it equally hidden, and every physical mitzvah has it equally transparent. You look at a Torah scroll and you're like, that's about God's essence, right? You look at a child learning haftarah for their bar mitzvah, that's about God's essence. It's clear. But that's different than how much of the light is radiating and expanded versus how much of the light is contracted. So that's why the conversation can kind of go here, because, well, hold on. If it's about revelation, is it about revelation of God's light and expansion? But I thought God's essence is being revealed here in a mitzvah no matter what. So where are we? So I want to keep our conversation simple. Every mitzvah is transparent to God's essence, God's countenance, let's call it. There's nothing hidden in terms of it's transparent to God's essence. But in terms of the light that's revealed, the illumination, call it, now that has expansion and contraction. And the physical mitzvah, although it's transparent to God's essence, it is a very contracted form of light where it just looks like a shofar or a lulav. Was that confusing enough? There's no way to explain it without bringing too many categories. And I went ahead and did it myself. So I apologize if that was more than I meant. But the image we want to stick with is the body and the soul, right? So the body is contracted light, like my hand is just a physical hand, right? It doesn't look like divinity unless you see it moving. You're like, oh, there's something in there. And then you realize, okay, this physical body has something animating it, that the light is expanded and apparent, and that's the Kavanah. So the physical body is like the mitzvah, and the Kavanah we put in, that's the soul where the light gets to really shine. Can we keep it at that? All right, let's we started late, so if people need to go, please go ahead. No need to let us know, but I get it. I wouldn't mind adding another 5 or 10 minutes just because we started late for technical reasons. Just as, right, Perush. Oh, where are we? Sorry, I lost my spot. Sorry, I can't hear you.
534.
Top of 534.
534.
Over the page. True. Dan, why don't we go with you? Yeah, please. Yeah, if you unmute, we're top of 534.
True in terms of the concealment of countenance. That is the degree to which the countenance, the inner aspect of the divine life force, is concealed. The light, that is the divine creative life force, is the same in both body and soul. It is concealed equally in both.
And so in terms of Hester Panim, in terms of God's essence, which we learned is transparent in every mitzvah, no matter what, boom, now God's essence is right here in the physical world. We made a home for God's essence in the physical world. In terms of God's countenance, oh, I lost my train of thought. In terms of concealment of God's countenance, in any physical being, in any alive being, that countenance is hidden in both. I look at a pet cat, or my daughter just got a little fish, which got stuck behind a filter and had to be, freed from its captivity. I look at that fish, and both in the soul and the body of the fish, God's countenance is equally hidden. I think I'm just seeing a separate living being, right? As we said, you can't find God's countenance in the physical or in the spiritual. It's hidden everywhere. The garments, Doreen.
The garments in which the light hides, conceals, and clothes itself are identical in body and soul.
Right, so when we're talking about something that's not being used for a mitzvah, the entire physical world is the same. The body and the soul, the physical and the spiritual aspects, they both conceal God's essence. You look at it and you don't think, oh, I'm looking at God. You think, oh, I'm looking at a living being.
For both body and soul are of this world, where throughout the world and all its creatures, spiritual as well as physical, the light and the life force issuing from the breath of God's mouth are equally concealed.
I have, I need to research this, because for me, I have a problem with this section, because we learned so many times that the Jewish soul is not a created thing. It is breathed into us directly from God. It's a piece of God. And now here we say, even in the, even a soul, now it conceals God's essence, right? And the breath of God's mouth is equally concealed. So this one line is puzzling me. I'm gonna have to bleed it, or I'm gonna have to look and see, so how does this fit in? But let's leave Jewish souls out of it. So every living thing, be it animal, plant, even its soul is energy from God, from God's speech, although here it says God breath, but God's speech, and it conceals that it's coming from God, that God's essence is hidden. By concealment
of the countenance and by the descent of life force from level to level by means of numerous powerful tzitzunim, contractions, to the various levels consisting of a chain-like succession of worlds.
So every physical body and every soul of every physical phenomena comes down through these contractions, these tzimtzumim, such that God's essence is hidden, and you wouldn't know that's actually God. You'd think it's just some living being. It's alive because it's alive. It has its own life. And the life is not directly tied to God. It's not apparent. I think all of us have that way of looking at the world. Paul, why don't you finish this off for us? If you unmute, top of 535. There you go. Thanks.
Okay. Finally, clothing itself in klipa nuga in order to give life to the totality of this material world.
And so anything permitted, anything that we can use as a mitzvah, it's come down through all these tzimtzumim so that you don't know it's coming from God. God's essence is hidden. And finally, clothes itself in klipa noga, and there it can become physical world, whether that is a rock, whether that is a plant, whether it's an animal, you know, a chicken that I might eat on Shabbat, or that might lay an egg that I would eat, or whether it's even a human being. It's all coming down, and God's essence is so hidden, I don't think I'm looking at God. That is a separate category than what we're talking about, the expansion and contraction of light, which we're comparing to body and soul. So there's a lot of categories here, but let me wrap it up once again. Any physical mitzvah, in terms of these two pages, in terms of the concealment of the countenance, that now is stripped away. I do a physical mitzvah, and it's apparent, this is coming straight from God. It's God's essence is right there. Even if I don't see the light of it because I'm dealing with a physical object, God's essence is not hidden at all, equally in any mitzvah. But in terms of the expansion and contraction of the light that's there, that's manifest, now we're getting to our conversation where you have a body and a soul. The body is the mitzvah, and the soul is my kavanah that I have, and that's where I add light and expansion and beauty that has a tremendous effect on the value of the mitzvah. So if that confused you as much as me, I hope you'll join us for next week's class when we'll keep going on into this conversation.
But this whole chapter.
What's that?
Next time we meet, can you review these last two pages? I totally lost you somewhere along the line. I don't know about anybody else, but I found it.
I'm with you. I've honestly, I've learned this with a few people in person and also online, and I need a Venn diagram to keep track of the different phenomena. So maybe I will try and I think it's a good idea. I think I'll make a little chart or something, Blinator again, and share my screen, and let's go through these two pages so that we can have something to look at. Would that help, Eleanor? Yeah.
Cantor, which prayer is the Shemona Esrei? Because we don't always name the prayers in our prayer book.
Good question. If anyone's not clear, Shemona Esrei is another word for the Amida, which is that prayer that starts with the Avot, right? Ad Hashem sifatai tiftach, Baruch atah Ad Hashem Elokeinu. So when we stand up with our feet together and do that prayer, that's the beginning of a whole section called the Shemona Esrei, the Amida. Yes, Eleanor?
When we were going through this section and some of the words that were thrown around, I went on the internet and I thought it was interesting that the countenance of God, they defined as the face of God.
Yes, because panim comes from the Hebrew of within, right? Innerness. So if you look at my shoulder, you probably don't know what kind of mood I'm in. You know nothing about my insides. You know nothing about my inner state. If you get a look at my face, boom, immediately we know, am I happy? Am I upset? Am I bored? Am I engaged? Am I asleep? Am I awake? When you look at someone's face, that's where you get a glimpse at their insides, their emotions, their intellect. So the Hebrew word panim, in that it comes from the root of within, talks about someone's inner essence. You want to have a conversation. You look into someone's eyes and you see their essence. So same thing with God and the world. When you say God's face turns towards you, that means now, of course, God's aware of everything, right? God is omniscient. God knows everything. So what does it mean? God turns God's face toward me. God didn't know I was here. God wasn't seeing me. It means God's essence is now focused deliberately on you, and you are having a relationship with God's essence, as opposed to God's light or God's omniscient knowledge, etc. Yeah, so it's confusing because the essence and the light, it's not so evident in the real world, the difference between someone's essence and someone's light, right? But with God's essence is something that doesn't come into any spiritual world, no matter how high, other than through Torah and mitzvahs, where they come down right into the physical world. So it's counterintuitive. All right, I'm going to sign off from Facebook. Thanks for, I see Diane said, interesting conversation. Thanks, Sherry, for watching. Feel free to join us in the future. If you want to come into the class, just email Maya at temple-israel.org. She's happy to send you the text and send you the links. But thanks for joining us on Facebook, and we'll end our broadcast and stop recording.